I'm Sue Stockdale and welcome to episode 70 of the Access to Inspiration podcast, the show where you can gain inspiration from people who may be unlike you. We hope that our stories and insights enable you to transcend your day-to-day challenges and reflect on what you are capable of achieving. This episode was recorded using Squadcast, the remote recording platform which empowers podcasters by capturing high-quality audio and video conversations that listeners love. We are proud that Squadcast are sponsors of this podcast series, and you'll find them at squadcast.fm. Well, today I'm talking to Sophie Dow, a former freelance correspondent, writer and founder of the Salvesen Mindroom Centre, and to discover what happened when she went on a search to discover a diagnosis for her daughter Annie, and how this led her to starting up a charity that has since helped tens of thousands of children and their families. One of my favourite anecdotes in this episode is when Sophie approached the Edinburgh International Conference Centre to host their first conference for the charity. When the organisation said it will cost £70,000, Sophie's reply was, "Well, I don't have £70,000, but I do have a vision." So listen on to find out how she overcame this and many other challenges to start up the charity. Welcome to the podcast, Sophie. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Sue.
It really intrigues me, this statement, when life didn't turn out as you imagined. So maybe there's a good place to start, is how did you imagine it when you were young?
Yes, so I think you're referring to the title of my book, which is When Life Doesn't Follow the Script, which it doesn't for anyone, really. So I'm Swedish. You might be able to hear that on my accent, which I have managed to maintain despite 40 years in the UK. I was working very happily at Swedish TV as an assistant director on the daily news program. This was in the early 80s. I had decided I was going to eventually progress to become a director and then eventually take over the sports department at Swedish TV. They don't know that, and I think they can thank their lucky star that life didn't turn out like that. So I had my career path planned out and I was very happy. I was single, 28, I think I was. And then I got an invitation to a wedding in New York, which I would have loved to go to. But my salary from Swedish TV wouldn't allow a return trip Stockholm, New York in 1981. So I had to say no. And I was pretty miffed to have to do that. However, 3 weeks before the wedding, I get a letter from a lawyer saying I had inherited a woman that I had never heard of in my life. And my sister and I and our two brothers, plus 12 people we had never met in our lives, all inherited £700 each from this woman who turned out to be my paternal grandmother's sister. So I took the £700, ran to a travel agent in Stockholm, which is still there, and bought a ticket to New York. At that wedding, I met my Scottish husband. In a nutshell, is how the sports department at Swedish TV can thank their lucky star, because I moved to London in 1982 to live with Robin.
Wow, wasn't that serendipitous to get that inheritance? And then what happened next?
So then I arrived in London. Nobody knew who I was. Nobody cared. I had fantastic letters of recommendation from the bosses of Swedish TV, but that didn't matter to anyone in London. I managed to somehow make my way into the head of Granada Television. I can't remember how I did that. Brought my 2 letters of recommendation to him and thought it would be a matter of minutes before he would have offer me a job. And this man was extremely irritated at having to meet me. And he paced up and down and shouted angrily, "Why on earth would I employ you?" And I was so taken aback by that all I could think of saying was, "Well, I'm a nice person." And he said, "Well, I can tell you there are 100 other people I would much rather employ rather than you." That was a very humiliating moment. And I remember taking the Northern Line home with tears of humiliation running down my face. But it also showed me that I had to really think outside the box and find another way to make my way in this new country that I now lived in. I am a journalist, so I then just started to build up a network, became a freelance correspondent for Swedish press, media and radio.
And as your career developed and you made the decision to have a family. And then how did that shape the next stage of your life?
So I had 12 years as a foreign correspondent and loved them. I had a fantastic time. My field was culture, so film, theater, human interest stories. And I interviewed all the big film stars, which was wonderful and fun. In between, Robin and I had two children. So we had James, who today is 34, 6'5" tall Swede, Scottish person. And Annie came along. Annie is 31 and Annie is mentally handicapped. So that completely changed our world. And eventually, when the children were 7 and 4, left London and moved up to Edinburgh in order to give the children a sort of more freer childhood up here. And that's also when we started to look into what it was we were facing with our daughter.
And when you did try to get answers to the questions that no doubt you had in your mind, what did you discover?
Well, first of all, try to get answers is not easy. It's still not easy. We clocked into the sick kids here to try and get some answers. And it was a 2-year endlessness of appointments with professionals that we didn't know, had never met, and trying to understand what it was we were facing, why Annie wasn't behaving and functioning like most other children. In the end, after 2 years, the conclusion then, this was in 1997, I think, so Annie was 7 at the time, was the diagnosis was brain damage that occurred during pregnancy. Today, when Annie is 31, we know that wasn't right, but that was as little as they knew then. And I remember after having been to see the consultant getting the definitive diagnosis we thought it was, then the sick kids said, well, thank you very much, we've done our bit. And I remember standing outside the sick kids completely bewildered because they didn't give us any further information. So I remember standing on the pavement thinking, what do we do now? And my inner compass had no north, south, east, or west. It just went round and round and round, like in the North Pole. I've read your book, Sue. It's excellent. Well, my inner compass was like the compass that you described when you go to the magnetic North Pole. It didn't stop anywhere. I had no answers. We didn't have any guidance or directions or anything. So thanks to being a journalist, I just set about of doing research. So what do? I talked to everyone I could think of. Eventually, I was given a book, so happened to be in Swedish, by a fantastic professor of psychiatry called Christopher Gilbert, who is still one of the world's leading experts on any form of learning difficulties, as it was called then, neurodiversity, as we call it now. The title of that book was One Child in Every Class. And I read that book and realized that that was the realm where we belong, which was learning difficulties. So ADHD, autism, Tourette syndrome, OCD, and so on. I'm sure you've heard of all of them. He described all of that. And I thought, well, this is the area where I need to focus my research. And then I thought, the title was One Child in Every Class. And I thought, oh, is it that common? Because up to then we had thought we were the only family in the world with a child like Annie. Then Christopher Gilbert, it so happened that he was organizing a big conference in Gothenburg in 1998. So I flew there, thinking still we were the only ones in the world with a child like Annie. I step into the auditorium and there are 2,700 delegates. In 1998, if we, Mindroom, we are organizing a big conference next year here in Edinburgh, our 6th conference. But if we get 2,700 in 2023, I'll be really happy. So in 1998, that was phenomenal. So I step into there are 2,700 delegates. And my first thought was, we are not alone. And then I looked at the demography of the delegates, and they were parents like myself. They were grandparents who wanted to help but didn't have the tools to do so. They were professors and teachers and head teachers and speech therapists, anyone that is needed in order to support and help a child that's struggling. So then I spent 2 days listening to desperate statistics about loneliness, bullying, exclusion, prison statistics, divorce in families, and even children who were thinking about suicide. And I found that completely unacceptable. I still find it completely unacceptable.
That must have been quite a relief to realise that you weren't alone, and then to get those statistics and information. I'm wondering what that caused or motivated you to do.
Absolutely, it was a reassurance, but it was a reassurance that gave me force because I knew I didn't have to plow my own furrow. Well, I have done in one sense. I realized actually this is a public health issue that hasn't been addressed. It's still a public health issue today in 2022. So you were asking what I did. Well, I found it utterly unacceptable. The thought of going back home to Edinburgh and to say to Annie, I'm really sorry, nothing can be done, was not on. So I decided to do something about this. And I felt I could. So the vision for Mindroom, Salvesen Mindroom now called, was born then and there. So I flew back home and I told Robin what I had experienced and what I had understood, that this is a public health issue that needs addressing. And I told him that I had a vision and I knew I could deliver it.
And other people at that point, Sophie, might see there's an issue, hope that they could perhaps have some sort of impact. But I'm wondering what gave you that inner belief that you could do something that would effectively change the way that today people with learning difficulties and their families are supported?
I had that question quite a lot. It's been 20 years. In one sense, I can't answer it. It just is innate, the strength within me. And I should thank my mother. My father died very early, but I should thank my mother, who was also a very strong person. But what drives me is human rights. Every single person that's born has the right to a dignified life. What I saw and heard at that conference was none of that. I find that unacceptable, and it's still my driving force. We live with Annie, and she has just as much right to a dignified life as you and I. So it's unacceptable that that's not the case. However, I think society creates or emphasizes someone's handicap. Annie is completely at ease with being mentally handicapped. We now know she's mentally handicapped, and I can talk about that later. But she's completely at ease with that. She has no problem with it. But society has a big problem with anyone who falls out with the norm.
So with that inner energy, that inner strength that you brought to wanting to make a difference, how did you then set up the charity, and how has it developed since you founded it?
I'd never done anything like that. I had been my own boss for the past 12 years and writing my articles and sending my invoices, and nobody could really tell me what to do. And here I had to really start from scratch and learn what is needed when you set up an organization, judicially, economically, and so on. And that's not my strength. I have likened it to, I don't know if you've seen the film Free Solo. El Capitan is a very vertical piece of rock, actually. And it felt like that at times. And I was very much outside my comfort zone. But I believed so much in the vision that I had created myself that I just kept going. I remember Robin saying to me, Robin, who has had a career in corporate life and so on, he said to me, you have to have a board when you create an organization. And I said, what? A board? Does that mean I have to listen to what other people think I should be doing? And he said, yes. And I said, oh, how many? And he said, at least 6. So I set about putting together what I thought was a board. You have to bear in mind, I was in a new city and part of the country. Nobody really knew me. And in order to put a board together, it's advantageous if you have a previous network, but I didn't have much of that. So I put together a board which consisted of a very good friend of mine who is very funny and has a son who is also learning disabled. Robin's sister, because she was extremely well organized, and a friend of ours who used to be Robin's former business partner and so on. And then I presented this suggestion of a board to Robin, and he said, "What do you think this is? Some sort of playground?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "You can't just have a board with friends. You have to find the right people, even if you don't like them, but if you think that they can contribute to your vision and to the organization, you should ask them." So that was a steep learning curve. I managed to put a fantastic board together, and we got going, I would say, in 2000, really launched ourselves in 2003 with a big conference at the Edinburgh International Conference Centre. That was the launch of what was then called Mindroom, which is now called the Salvesen Mindroom Centre.
And from not knowing about how to set up a charity or an organisation to having a conference at the Edinburgh International Conference Centre, which for the listener who's not been to Scotland, is one of the premier conference venues in Britain. How did even that happen?
Yes. By that time, attended many conferences, very often in pretty crap venues where the technology didn't work, that sort of stuff. And I had decided that the whole issue of what we now call neurodiversity is a huge issue. And if we're going to do something about it, everything that we do has to be top quality. And what we say, what we produce, where we have conferences and so on, top quality. So the EICC was an obvious place to go to. So I go there, I suppose it was 2001 or maybe 2002, because it takes time to plan a conference. And I said, "Oh, I would like to have a conference here." I'd never done anything like that. And they said, "Oh, yes, of course, that'd be £70,000. And I said, "Well, I don't have £70,000, but I have a vision. And here's my vision." And I said, "So could you defer all the invoices, please?" And somehow they said yes. That was amazing. And then I proceeded to invite 16 of the best speakers I had listened to through the years. And I said the same thing to them. "We need you here in Scotland. We don't have any money, but we have a lot of whiskey. And my husband is a member of Muirfield Golf Club. So if you want to play golf, you can play with him. Please come for free." And all 16 said yes. And they came from Yale, they came from Oxford, they came from Sweden, they came from Australia, they came from Berkeley, and so on. And then I had never done a conference either. Anyway, we opened the doors and 1,000 delegates came. And that was the launch of Mindroom.
Wow, what a start. It strikes me that the mindset that you had at that start point about valuing the charity, valuing what was going to be said, is actually a reflection of what your overall message is about society and how it needs to value everybody.
Yes, that's a very good thought. I think that's also how and why we have been successful. Is, I do quite a lot of public speaking, both in Sweden and here, and we are all only human beings. And neurodiversity, or learning difficulties as it was called for so long, it exists in every family, whether you're a royal or not, as it were. What I do is I always sort of put it on that level. We are all only human beings.
And if you're enjoying this episode, you might want to listen to some others in our back catalogue. In episode 16, Sarah Lang talked about how she set up a network for women in the infrastructure sector in New Zealand after realising that none existed. And then in episode 41, Amy Henderson also shares how she was motivated to build a better future for working parents in the US because of her own experience. So go on over to accesstoinspiration.org and you can listen to all of those episodes there and read the transcriptions. Now back to this episode with Sophie. And what does the Salvesen Mindroom Centre do? 21 years later, here you are. What services does it provide?
So the main part of Salvesen Mindroom is what we call direct help and support. And that is in effect like a clinic. We help anyone that contact us, whether they have a diagnosis or not. Actually, it's very important that we say that because right now, and it has been for years, there is a more or less a 2-year waiting list for a child or a family to get into the system and get a diagnosis. And those years are lost years. You don't have 2 years to wait. So we have always said we help anyone who contact us, whether you have a diagnosis or not. And we help the child, always with the child at the center. We help the family to whatever it is that they need to guide them towards a diagnosis, or we mediate in schools, or we give advice for transmission when they leave school or when they go from primary to secondary and so on. Those are very crucial times in a child's life. So that's what the direct help and support does. Since we started, we have helped tens of thousands of families, but there are so many more still that needs help. We also do workshops and we collaborate with the General Teaching Council for Scotland. We advise the Scottish government on these issues and so on. And we have our own research centre at Edinburgh University. We have always said that we need to work with the scientists. We work further down the line. We need to understand what happens in the brain in order to be better prepared and better help further down the line. So we have our own research centre at Edinburgh University, headed up by Professor Sue Fletcher-Watson, who is a professor of developmental psychology. It's called the Salvesen Mindroom Research Centre. And together with Salvesen Mindroom, we work out different studies and so on. And ultimately, we want to reform the system because it isn't working. A 2-year waiting list, if that, isn't acceptable. But that is a very big task, but we're working on it.
It seems like you like a bold vision, Sophie, not something that's a small vision, but something ambitious. I'm wondering if you were asking Annie what she makes of what you've done, what would Annie be saying?
That's a really nice question, Sue. Annie is very proud whenever we're together, and if I'm either introduced as the founder or I say that I am the founder, she will say, "Excuse me, I am the founder of Salvesen Mindroom Centre." She's completely on board with that. And she's very proud of what we do and at ease with, as I said before, being someone who is mentally handicapped. So shall I tell you how we know now what diagnosis she had? So we were looking and asking everywhere for a better diagnosis than the one we got in 1997, which was brain damage that occurred during pregnancy. It wasn't specific enough. So I kept looking and asking. And eventually I asked Christopher Gilberg, who had by then become a friend and had spoken at several of our conferences. And I asked Christopher if he would assess Annie and look at her. So he said, of course, and we flew over to Gothenburg, the whole family, and he assessed Annie for 2 days, still couldn't pinpoint what was the reason or the diagnosis. But he said, I think you should look at something being chromosomally not right. And that wasn't something we had thought of before. By this time, Annie was 13, still couldn't read and write and so on. She still can't really read and write, has no concept of time or of consequences. She has many, many strengths, but there are also weaknesses. So we flew back to Edinburgh. I contacted David Fitzpatrick, who is a professor of genetics here in Edinburgh, and asked him if he could have a look at Annie for a specific chromosome fault that Christopher had suggested. He did, took her blood sample in 2003. He said he didn't think it was what Christopher had suggested, and it wasn't. But David said, can I please save Annie's blood sample while I wait for better technology? And we said, of course. So 4 years later, on the 18th of July, you have these dates burnt into your memory. 18th of July 2007, we get a letter, a second class post from David saying, "Dear Sophie and Robin, I now have a stronger loop in my microscope and I have screened down his blood sample, and she does indeed have a small but significant chromosome deletion on chromosome 1, the upper arm. 25 genes out of the 22,000-ish that we all need to have in order to stand a good chance in life, we're missing. And those 25 genes are the cause of Annie's mental handicap. She is the only one in the world with this particular chromosome profile. She still is. So we asked Annie if we could call it Annie's syndrome in order to push boundaries and also make it a more personal thing. So it's now called Annie's syndrome rather than the Fitzpatrick syndrome, which it should have been because it was David who discovered it.
Wow. So you're making a mark, you and Annie and the charity, in the whole field of neurodiversity.
Yes.
And as you look into the future, you talked about a conference coming up next year. What's that going to involve?
So being a journalist, a very big and important part of Salvesen Mindroom has always been, for me, to create awareness and to get information out there in order to tackle the very damaging stigma that still surrounds any form of learning difficulty. I get very cross when I think of that because the stigma is really based on ignorance. So it's very important to get information out there. So we have had 5 very big conferences through the years, parallel to all the other work that we've done. And next year, we are now staging a very big international event back at the EICC, 20 years on from when we first were there. And it's a big conference called It Takes All Kinds of Minds. And it will talk about all kinds of neurodiversity.
So any of our listeners who are interested to find out more about that conference, how might they do that, Sophie?
Well, there is the excellent website for the conference. It's called It Takes All Kinds of Minds. And so the website is called itacon.org. And if you go there, you'll have all the information you need for the conference. And also, if you book now, you get very advantageous early bird prices. So, for instance, for private person, personally funded, as we call it, if you book now, early bird is £225. We have 50 speakers so far, very high profile, and they range from scientists to people who are experts on the benefits of surfing and mental health, for instance. It will span the whole thing. So really, to summarize it, is about science and reality.
Wow, that sounds like it's going to be quite an event. And if you were sharing any of the wisdom or learning that you have gained during the years, what would be a message you'd want to leave for our listeners?
In one sense, that's a multifaceted question. For me, I always talk about Annie, and so many with her, has shown us a completely different universe from the universe that we thought we knew before. And Annie's universe is just as valid as yours and mine. I am absolutely fascinated by the brain and the mind. And so we work with neuroscientists, and I love hearing what they have to say. Every year I ask them, they find it rather irritating because they think it's a very simplistic question, but I ask them, how much do we know about the brain today? One of them says, at best, 1.5%. And another one says, well, maybe a little bit more, but not even 10%. All of them say that is the big challenge of the 21st century, is to try and understand more about how the brain and the mind works. And for me personally, I suppose to answer your question, first of all, I find that very exciting. It's like discovering a whole new continent. Then I want to see a paradigm shift in how we look at and understand the brain and the competence of everybody. So with the further understanding of the brain, I hope will come a much more inclusive way of looking at everybody, an inclusive way that includes all kinds of minds and makes sure that no mind is left behind.
Wow, that's a powerful message from which to leave us. One thing I didn't ask you about, Sophie, was about your book that you wrote. It's written in Swedish, I understand, soon to be in English as well.
Yes, one of the things of being a founder, I find the responsibility is to know when to hand over to the next person. And I see Salvesen Mindroom as my third child, but a child should grow up and leave home. So I've always been very aware that my responsibility is to hand over when I'm no longer as effective as a CEO, if you like. You come to a point, and I know you talk about entrepreneurship in your book. And, I think I am a starter up person. And then there comes a point when it's very important to hand over to someone who knows how to take it to the next step. So I did that a few years ago, and I'm now, quote unquote, only on the board, which allowed me time to write, which is what I really love doing. So I was asked to write a book by a Swedish publisher. That in itself was wonderful. So I wrote this book called When Life Doesn't Follow the Script. And I leave it inte följer manus in Swedish. It was published in 2018. And if I may boast a little bit, it had 5-star reviews. It's not a sad book about having a child that's mentally handicapped. It's a book about life with Annie, which is never dull. I talk about neuroscience, and I talk about all the struggles that was involved in setting up an organization when you're not a business person and so on. And it has a lot of hope, that book. So it's been translated now to English, and it will be ready for the conference next year. It's also being translated into French.
Wonderful. So your mission to generate greater awareness, no doubt, will happen with those other language versions of your book coming out in due course.
I hope so.
I've really enjoyed our conversation, Sophie. I think it's a very important topic for all of us to be more aware of. And I'm sure that our listeners will want to discover more about Salvesen Mindroom Centre as well. How might they do that on the internet?
The web address is www.mindroom.org, mindroom.org. I also have a website now, which is Sophie-Dow.com.
Wonderful. Well, it's been a real pleasure to speak to you, Sophie, today, to hear about your journey and the unexpected and wonderful outcomes that have happened when your life didn't follow the script.
Nor did yours, Sue. I recommend everyone to read your book, Explore a Life in Adventure. It's so inspirational. I will never go to Antarctica or Greenland or Kenya or the magnetic North Pole. So I was very happy to read about it and your thoughts and struggles as well, and how life has taken you in the most unexpected directions.
Well, there is the commonality between both of us, Sophie. And thank you so much for your time. Well, I hope Sophie's story inspired you. And if there's someone you know that needs some help, perhaps supporting someone with learning difficulties, then make sure you tell them to listen to this episode and find out more about Salvesen Mindroom Centre. Next week, I'll be back in the guest chair myself, and I'll be talking to Evelien van den Heuvel about how I inspire people to step into the unknown. I hope you can join us then.